A very good evening. We gathered here for Speechathon, EdgeConX Kaching 2022. I am Vedika, President EdgeCon X Kaching 2022. EdgeCon, or the Economic Justice Conclave, was started as an extension of Kaching in the year 2019 by the students of Sarla Anil Modi School of Economics in MIOS, Mumbai. We started EdgeCon to be able to discuss a specific theme which has socioeconomic importance and discuss it in various ways, in various dimensions, under one single roof. Speechathon is an extension of the same. The theme for this year is free, and we are discussing dimensions of freedom and all of its important socio-economic aspects. Speechathon is our first student-driven initiative for EdgeCon, and very happy to welcome you here. Judges, participants, I hope you have a great time. I'll pass it on to Nehal Bisht, who is going to moderate today's session.
At EdgeCon X Kaching 2022, we want to know what the youth has to say about relevant issues affecting each youth to Speechathon 21, which gives us the opportunity to have a discussion on the most pertinent problems in the 21st century with our peers and come up with comprehensive solutions to these dichotomous dilemmas. Now, I would like to take this opportunity to welcome our judges. Nisha Khanna is a renowned psychologist and mental health professional. She's a certified EQ coach, expert TV and radio panelist, and a TEDx speaker. She has worked as a counselor in the Swadhar project of the Human Resource Ministry under the Women and Child Development Department. She deals with parent and child relationships, depression, insomnia, anxiety, and all other kinds of moods, emotions, temperaments, personality, and behavioral issues. We welcome you, ma'am. Next, we have Yvette Lee. She's a counselor by profession and has been working in the field of mental health since the last 14 years. Her expertise lies in mental health counseling, crisis, grief, and trauma counseling, and adolescent and marriage counseling. She has worked in the past with people living with mental illnesses and is currently associated with MES and works with students with behavioral, emotional, psychological, and academic difficulties. She's conducted workshops with teachers, students, parents, and other stakeholders on varying topics such as self-concept, self-image, leadership, sex education, life skills, conflict management, and problem solving. She completed her MSW in 2008 and has also completed her NLP training. She is currently pursuing her PhD on the topic of parenting, which has always been her area of interest. Thank you for being here with us today. Now, I would like to introduce the format of the debate. Each speaker has 2 minutes to present their opening arguments. The opening speech of the proposition will be followed by the opening speech of the opposition. Then, the proposition and opposition will get 1 minute each for rebuttals. The participants can use this time to critique the opening arguments of the opposite speaker. We will then move on to the cross-examination of the proposition by the opposition. The cross-examination will last for 1.5 minutes. The opposition should ask the question and the proposition should answer it within this time limit. Please remember to ask precise questions that end with a question mark. We will then proceed to ask questions from the audience. The audience is requested to send their questions to Rachit Mehta during the course of the debate. The best question will be getting a cash prize too. The same process will be then repeated for the opposition. That being said, I would like to welcome the first debating pair. The first topic before the House today is that the House believes that in a materialistic society, it is the possession of financial wealth that gives way to psychological freedom. Going for the topic is Akriti Kushwaha, and going against the topic is Sakshi Sharma.
So should I start? Am I audible?
We will just be spotlighting the opposition as well. Akriti, you have 2 minutes to make your opening argument. You may proceed.
Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay. Matthew Killingsworth, a senior at Pans Walton School who studies human happiness, collected 1.7 million data points over 33,000 participants to prove his stance that the more money you have, the more choices about how to live your life you get, which clearly means that in this materialistic society, it is the possession of financial wealth that gives you a way of financial freedom. A very good evening to one and all present here. This is Akriti Kushwaha going to speak in favor of the topic. Okay, so now let's assume that we don't have mobile phones on which we stroll through social media, laptops on which we take our online classes, or cars, scooters which we use to go to the nearby market. In that case, will we have our sanity intact? Will we have a sense of psychological freedom? Won't we be in a situation where everyone is ahead of us? Yes, my dear friends, the answer is pretty obvious. And that's why I'm standing here supporting the stance. Now, let's talk about facts and take the case of world's most developed economy, that is America, where according to a survey named as Stress in America by American Psychology Association, it is found that financial wealth is the second most prominent stressor for Americans. First being the future of the nation, and third being the work. And it is no surprise at all that all these delineate to one indicator, that is money, wealth, financial possession. And that's why I am very strongly believe that in this materialistic era where relationship, the way you think, the respect you get from others, all revolves around how much you earn. What is your bank balance and from which financial background?
Akriti, you have elapsed your time. Please make your closing statement.
Yeah. So how much money do you have? All pans, or how much financial background you come from. And third, it affects the psychological freedom, that is emotions, how you feel, how you react, and what you think. With this, I rest my case. Thank you.
Thank you, Akriti. Sakshi, you have 2 minutes to present your opening argument.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
All right. Greetings to the House at large. I will be speaking against the motion using two constructives. One, materialistic systems are detrimental for psychological freedom, and two, universal socio-cultural expectations impact the rich differently. Firstly, this debate is set in a materialistic society, a society where possession of financial wealth and assets is expected to give the most satisfaction to the consumer. The law of diminishing marginal utility doesn't apply to money, which is why a materialistic society is always related to systems that encourage creation of more and more wealth. A capitalist system, for instance, has a growth imperative, where the capitalist has to keep selling their commodity in order to ensure their own subsistence and to keep the production going. Thus, to meet that, moreover, producers are almost always in competition with other individuals selling the same commodity. Thus, in order to meet or beat the market price for that commodity, profit has to be reinvested to increase efficiency. With this built-in tendency to grow, even the richest are chained to a system of profit, where they cannot make their choices on their own with their intellectual inkling. When their motive is always profit, how can they prioritize creativity or invention? Because ultimately they're running a business. Regardless of access to information, their choices are tainted. Secondly, our systems of wealth creation necessitate certain kinds of behaviors that may be antithetical to what one believes in or is comfortable with. For instance, the Kardashian clan, who are pop culture icons in the West, are extremely wealthy and continue to expand their own beauty businesses. Their success is dependent upon incredible obsession with how they look and present themselves. They invest in beauty procedures so that they can maintain their brand and continue to sell more. However, these women also suffer from body image issues and find that the more they modify their looks, the more criticism they receive, as sociologists have also found. Despite this, they continue to enhance their beauty because their brand is built around the idea of a perfect woman. Therefore, the Kardashians, in fact, for the Kardashians, their wealth, which is something that they have access to, is determining the kind of way in which they are succumbing to beauty standards. So standards of beauty universally enslave people across demographics and hinder independent decision making. But for the Kardashians, their wealth is something that provides access to plastic surgery, expensive makeup, and wardrobe, which is causing them to succumb to standards of beauty even more. It's exacerbating the problem of attaining psychological.
Actually, you've elapsed your time. Please make the closing statement.
Right. In conclusion, these systems are culturally hegemonic, even for the rich, and thus determine their course of action and the agency they have over their choices. Thank you.
Thank you, Sakshi. Akriti, you have 1 minute for the rebuttal. And please switch on your video. Yes, you may begin.
Yeah. So the stance presented by the opposition is good for preaching, but not practical for me. Because the main objective of any individual is to attain self-actualization, that is being happy and psychologically free, along with having the possession of financial wealth that give them a sense of status symbol in the society. As stated by the opposition, that wealthy are in constant competition of acquiring the most desirable object, which I feel that is a natural tendency. And let's take the example of a poor Golgappa seller on the street. He also has a natural tendency to compete and to sell more than the fellow momo, tikki, or rose seller on the same street. So it is more of a natural tendency, and it is a very natural phenomenon. So, and that's why I believe that in this materialistic society, it is the possession of financial wealth that gives you a sense of psychological freedom. Thank you.
Thank you, Akriti. Sakshi, you have 1 minute to critique the opening argument of Akriti. You may proceed.
Right. So Antonio Gramsci, who is a Marxist thinker, coined and elaborated on the term of cultural hegemony. According to this, people don't control ideas, but ideas control people. It indicates that the existence of larger systems controlling our actions and behaviors are what put into motion our own actions. Therefore, the idea that anyone can be psychologically free because of the money that they have is something that is completely false. Side proposition is trying to draw a correlation between the quality of life of a person and the psychological freedom that they have. However, they too are actually victims of a system that is trying to inbuild greed in people and is trying to enforce a profit motive in people. In this case, the existence of labor unions, anti-corporate movements, and resistance to exploitation show that the poor are actually more acutely aware of their own enslavement in these systems, while the rich are insulated because of the fact that they have so much money. So in this case, the rich are actually more closely tied to capitalist systems, and this idea of profit, which is something that the side proposition claims is inherent because there are multiple systems of society that exist without the system of greed. Therefore, I would like to rest my case by talking about how the poor are in fact more psychologically free and the rich are in fact enslaved to ideas of greed and profit. Thank you.
Thank you, Sakshi. Akriti, now is the cross-examination of the proposition by the opposition. You have 1.5 minutes. Please remember to keep your questions short and precise, and they must end with a question mark.
Yeah. Sakshi, as per the Times of India report of 2018, the people who are poor are most likely to be depressed. Don't you think that possession of financial wealth in that case is a way to psychological freedom?
Thank you for your question. So in this case, psychological freedom does not equate to happiness. The question isn't whether money is going to give you happiness. The question is whether you can truly understand the systems that are actually causing you to act the way you act. And in this psychological freedom, like I mentioned, people who are fighting against these systems, people who are actually more acutely aware of them, like the poor population of our country is using anti-union, is finding anti-corporate movements and labor unions in order to fight against these systems. But it is the rich who are enslaved to these ideas. This isn't a moral judgment on the quality of life that they have. Obviously, the rich have a better quality of life and they live an insulated life. However, they're not free. Being free and happy are two different ideologies. Thank you.
Akriti, you still have time, so you can question her further.
I have a related question. So, any individual's main objective is to attain self-actualization through financial possession. Then, how you can say that financial wealth doesn't matter for your sanity? And I'm talking in context with the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So, yeah, that's a question. Like, then how you can say that financial wealth doesn't matter for one's individual sanity? Yeah.
Again, the idea, sanity and freedom are two different ideas. The concept here is that psychological freedom is extremely important for an individual to realize where they stand in society. The poor are enslaved because of our system. And when we understand that these are systems, for instance, Antonio Gramsci talks about it, that there is a cultural hegemony in the world, that the rich and the poor realize that they are part of different systems and therefore are able to find that they are making different actions and decisions based on their own reality.
Sakshi, thank you.
All right.
With this, we come to the end of the cross-examination round. Now we will be entertaining questions from the audience. Audience members who wish to ask a question can send it to Mr. Rachit Mehta. All right, an audience member has posed this question for Sakshi. Actually, this question is for Akriti. So, a renowned study found a high correlation between perceived monetary power and mood disorders such as depression, bipolar disorder, and anxiety. So, how do you argue that people with more wealth are more free in psychological terms?
The question is for me as well?
Yes, the question is for the proposition.
Okay. As also I presented in my opening statement that yes, there is a correlation between how an individual generally feels psychologically and with their financial wealth. I would like to give a relevant example over here. Let's take the example of the wife of Shah Rukh Khan, that is Gauri Khan, or wife of Akshay Kumar, that is Twinkle Khanna. So, when we are talking about psychological freedom, we also talk about the creative side of an individual. So, in that context, see, as Gauri Khan is a furniture designer and like Twinkle Khanna is a book writer. So when you get that creative freedom and creative wisdom of actually pursuing something of that dialect, of that area, then you know that you are backed with financial positions and wealth, and you have that what should I say, that financial wealth behind you, that you need not to worry about how your family gonna sustain. So talking this thing into a middle class perspective, I would say that people here like quest for financial position, financial wealth, so they actually attain a sense of like fulfillment in their life, and ultimately their whole aim and goal of achieving self actualization becomes fulfilled. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Akriti. We will now proceed to the cross-examination of the proposition by the opposition. You have 1 minute, 30 seconds.
So I ask a question, right?
Yes.
All right. So my question is self-actualization as a concept only based around sustenance and not worrying about your economic condition, or does it also include the way in which you deal with, say, caste violence, regardless of whether you're an upper caste member who's rich? So does it also include all these intersectional ways in which you're affected, or these socioeconomic ways in which you're affected?
So the whole concept of self-actualization is in itself, it's very broad. But self-actualization is the ultimate step that every individual quests in its life to acquire. So at the very basic level, it is the basic needs like you like shelter, clothes, food that you get, and then you become fulfilled of that, and then you like as a human proceed towards achieving the self-actualization, which means becoming a complete person in terms of in financial wise, like you have the wealth, and along that you are sustaining your family, and as a person you are giving to the society as well. So but the very important aspect of self actualization is having acquiring a status symbol in the society and becoming fulfilled on the aspect of the financial wealth that you hold, because uh, as an individual everybody has a complex of comparing each other, and in that context when you achieve a sense of fulfillment, you become complete as a person, and that's really what self actualization means. Thank you.
Thank you, Akriti. Now we'll be opening the floor to questions from the audience. Sakshi, a question has come in for you. A relatively small amount of wealth keeps people from taking risks and following what they truly believe in, which restricts their psychological freedom. So, how do you argue that people with money can be more free?
Right, like I said, in this situation, there's not the only way of attaining self-actualization, as the proposition has put it, is not through money. And that's the point I've been trying to make. Various things such as wealth has its own problems. If you want to take an example, think of Squid Game, which was recently popularized by Netflix. And it talks about how the end message of that is that even when you're rich, you are faced with problems such as depression. You're faced with problems where you're affected by, say, universal standards of beauty. So those things don't go away. And therefore, we find that regardless of the money you hold, you will always face certain types of problems. The problems in their magnitude might change, but the psychological freedom that you're talking about is never complete for any individual. And therefore, I think that these two things are not comparable in their nature.
Right. Thank you, Sakshi. We have Navya Goyal from the audience asking a question to Sakshi. What could be a way to provide psychological freedom while still having the objective of profit earning?
Right. So psychological freedom and profit earning are often, one would argue, against each other, because there are certain factors like caste, religion, and gender that often make sure that you're inherently more rich than the other. These systems don't exist independently of themselves. These systems don't exist as people who want to simply earn money. But there will always be an inherent bias between two people, which is why if someone wants profit, if someone is trying to be more successful in this industry or is trying to start a business, one group of people will always be more successful than the other. So these two categories don't always go together. There will always be a hegemonic practice of the more powerful over people who don't have as many resources, which is why these two practices can't always go together unless there is a system where there is a complete even playing field, which is very unlikely to happen because there are already existing biases and differences in our lives.
Thank you, Sakshi. With that, we come to the end of the first set of debaters. Thank you so much for participating. Now, the audience will have 1.5 minutes to participate in the poll that will be popping up soon. We will also be screen sharing the topic in the context for reference. Please choose the side and the name of the debater who made you doubt your opinion the most. With that, we are completed with we're done with the audience polling. We will now be moving on to the next topic. The second topic before the House today is that the House believes that advertising has made the distinction between needs and wants impossible among the public. Going for the topic is Angel Rose Binu, and going against the topic is Dishita Puri.
Could you please raise your hand so that we can spotlight you? Right. Yes.
Angel, you have 2 minutes to present your opening argument. You may begin.
Okay, I'll give a countdown before I start my speech. Am I properly audible?
Yes, you're audible. Please begin.
Okay, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. So panel, the basic understanding of this debate, we are debating on the topic that whether the advertisement has described or taken away the perception of people distinguishing between their needs and wants. So basically in this debate, what we have to understand is what is basically need, what is basically wants. So understanding what is a need. A need is something that is very essential for sustaining the life. That could be food, shelter, clothing, or things like that. But need could be something that you desire for. That necessarily can be a designer clothing. So that could be some very expensive car or vehicle, transportation, something like that. So what is understanding how advertising plays an important role here? Advertisement is about selling a product that is it is majorly in a capitalistic society that has an important society. So what is the major role? How the psychological freedom of people is getting hampered here? So basically what we have here is manufactured choices. When the advertising company is pursuing for, or they are promoting something, they give us manufactured choices. That is, they run emotional ideas. That is the people tend to believe that you have to buy something. A person who is necessarily happy with the cycle sees this advertisement that is saying that you have to buy a car to have this prestigious status in the social circle. So that is something emotionally attacking them. That is how psychologically it's a trick that is played on them. And the second thing is that how exactly it highlights your flaws. That is how exactly we have this unusual illogical beauty standards that still exist in our society, that it tells us, the advertisement tells us you have to be fair, you have to be very beautiful in the society to have a social standing. That is what advertisement is all about. So this is something that evokes our desires and make us believe that you have to be something else. You have to have this thing, you have to have this particular thing in your life to be successful. Understand what is the need and wants here. Okay, you have a handbag, this purpose is that you can carry objects. Suppose that the same want is that you have to buy a Gucci bag or a particular designer bag to have a standing in society. This is what needs and wants, what is advertisement, what advertisement actually preaches in the status quo is currently right there.
Thank you, Angel. Dishita, you have 2 minutes to present your opening argument. You may begin.
One second. I'll just be giving a countdown. Am I completely audible?
Yes, you're clearly audible.
Perfect. Okay. 1, 2, 3, go. Waking up in the morning with a big cup of chai latte and Hrithik Roshan with his Rado on the front page is all what my morning routine consists of. The watch he wears is beyond exceptional. I agree 100%. Do I want it? Of course I do. But do I absolutely need it in my life? Not in a million years. A very good evening to one and all present here. Today I, Dishita Puri, stand before you speaking against the motion that advertising has made the distinction between needs and wants impossible among the public. 11th grade business studies taught us the basic thin line of difference between a need and a want. My clothes are my need. My food is my need. My education is my need. Wanting to wear a Louis Vuitton and eating at Taj is what I wish to have, but it is not absolutely essential for my life and hence just becomes a mere want. Advertising is just giving us the choices that we have to satisfy these basic needs. Whether or not the consumer gets influenced negatively by these choices is the consumer's discretion and not the advertiser's fault. Let us journey back. To eat at a local vendor or Taj is my choice. Taj's appeal might make me happy, but would I be miserable without the ambience? Definitely not. Advertising can be done from a pin to an elephant. To be elaborate, advertisers give me choices within my budget too. But getting influenced, going ahead and spending way over my limit is my choice. Blaming advertising does sound very convenient. But there are 100 factors that could have influenced me into such an action. Be it peer pressure, societal pressure, the pressure of maintaining a status symbol, and the list can go on forever. In the end, I'd only like to say that advertising is done for different stratas of the society, be it the middle class, the rich, or the ultra rich, and will be continue to do so. It is going to be our IT's discretion to go ahead and make up our mind as to what our pocket allows. Variety is the spice of life, they say. And all advertising is doing is giving us that very choice. With this, I rest my case. Thank you.
Thank you, Dishita. Now we'll move on to Angel. Angel, you have 1 minute to present a rebuttal.
Okay, so I think the opposition is clearly agreeing how exactly what is needs and what exactly desires are. Okay, when you say that you have this particular thing that you need in life, okay, I agree with it, totally understanding. I'm not blaming advertising. When you say that there are peer pressure, there is social cues, there can be different status and advertising giving you choices, necessarily, yes, they are giving you choices. But the marketing strategies they are using, it is necessarily that is impacting your psychological freedom. When I say psychology, it is something that people necessarily believe. This is a country where richer gets richer and the poorer gets poorer. And people tend to improve their betterment of living. They try to improve themselves. And when advertisement is telling you, okay, this is something that is going to particularly help you improve your life standards, then that is something that hits the core. That is something they wanted. Even if they don't have, they have to struggle for it. They still take it. Okay, understanding where I gave the example of having a luxury car and a cycle. Necessarily, a person can be happy, but then it is something that gives them a social standard, it gives them a status in the society, that they tend to believe it. That is my major rebuttal. Even if the choice is that choice gets manufactured, that is the problem.
Thank you, Angel. Dishita, you have 1 minute to present a rebuttal.
Sure. I'm starting. Unlike what my respected opponent said, advertising is just making things easier for us. Even when it is exhibiting products way beyond what we can afford, I agree, it drives us to work harder for the same. We get that rush to earn higher. Would anyone present here honestly tell me that they would be able to live in a world where products are just handed over to us according to our living conditions, our economic standards, or maybe our living standards? No, right? So my question at the end is, why do we curse advertising when all it is doing is giving us a varied option to choose from, even when they are basic necessities of life? Thank you.
With that, we will move on to the cross-examination of the proposition by the opposition. You have 1.5 minutes. Dishita, you can begin.
So basically, I wanted to ask you that, see, making a decision is a voluntary action, right? But going ahead and choosing to buy is our choice. It's upon us. And getting negatively, everything has a positive and a negative effect. And we all can agree that advertising has more positive effects than negative effects. So going ahead and getting negatively affected by it as our choice. So how can we blame advertising for the same?
Okay, so your question is, how can we blame advertising for the same? Okay, I'm not blaming advertising for something that they are giving necessary choices. The problem is that we are living in a society where there are role models existing. We look onto for our father, our people, or somebody else for getting role models. So we stick to that. That is how things work in a society. That is basically how things run. So when advertisements are necessarily giving us choices that are manufactured in nature, which is beneficially, which are in written, it's without any doubt, it's for their profit. The choice that people are going to make is doubtful. When you say advertisement are making things easier for you, you have to decide. You have like a 500 rupee and you might think, okay, should I have to buy a bag right now? That is very important. That's a need for me. Or should I work hard and make more money so I could buy a Gucci bag or something? So that is the problem here. Advertisement gives you choices, but choices are manufactured in nature and capitalistic nature, which are in favor of them. And this necessarily puts you in a difficult position where you have to think a lot. And it can be in an emotional way, how they run this psychological play. So it actually puts you in a difficult position where you have to decide and think for yourself, and it could be like very difficult for you.
Thank you, Angel. We'll now be proceeding to questions from the audience. Audience members who wish to ask a question to the proposition, please text them to Mr. Rachit Mehta. The first question that we have for the proposition is, Product recommendations on the internet come up due to previous searches for the same product, which means that they needed it and searched for it. Therefore, how has advertisement blurred the distinction?
Okay, so when you talk about needs, basically when these searches come, okay, needs varies from people. Okay, if I have to buy something tomorrow, then that is particularly my need. The other person who necessarily does not need that product in their life. So the problem is that when we go, we get recommendations and we then tend to believe that, okay, this particular thing has been bought by 1,000 people. This particular thing has been bought by people and they have put this review. So I, despite of my social status, despite of the community where the situation I am in, I tend to believe that, okay, I have to buy this particular product to have to a greater extent that particular amplification in the society. So that is the problem. When we necessarily talk that advertisement gives you choices, they gives you like an opportunity to get to know more products in a greater extent. The problem is that you get to know them. You get to have many choices. It is voluntary. It is your decision. But still, that decision is doubtful because it can get easily affected. It can get easily affected by the exterior people. It can get affected by the people who are influencing or put a comment there. So there is your needs and basically your desire gets blurred and the vague line between them gets merged. That's the problem.
Yes, we have another question. This one has been posed by Jayaditya Mohan. When the speaker uses desires while talking about people craving societal acceptance, doesn't the speaker themselves concede that the said action to buy a Gucci handbag is in itself a want?
Pardon the question?
I will repeat it for you. When the speaker uses desires while talking about people craving societal acceptance, doesn't the speaker themselves concede that the said action to buy a Gucci handbag is in itself a want?
So that is why I started my debate with the notion that needs and wants are very different. And the opposition has clearly stated it, yeah, it's a need. Like need could be something that is very essential, something a clothing, a food, a shelter, education, that are basically your needs. And want is something that you desire for. Despite of your struggles, despite of situation you are in, you want something in life. That is in and itself, it's not something wrong. It is okay. You can desire for something that is, if that necessarily makes you happy, then you can do that. But the problem here is that should be your choice, your particular choice. Having a Gucci bag for myself should be my personal choice, but it shouldn't be affected by an advertisement that is saying that having a Gucci bag with you is gonna like give you amplification in society. That is like gonna help you overcome the social fear and gives you a particular status or a symbol of luxury or wealth in the society. Then that in itself is what these advertisements or the capital, which are capitalistic in nature, is manufactured. And you tend to believe that is where this want actually becomes something that hampers your basic living or your prioritizing what you necessarily need and want in life.
Thank you, Angel. We will now be proceeding to the cross-examination of the opposition by the proposition. You have 1.5 minutes. You may begin.
Okay, so in your speech, you said that advertisements are giving you choices and it actually helps you. And there is nothing wrong with advertisement to do so. Do you believe that everything that happens nowadays, or even the advertising companies, do that for the benefit of the people? Okay, for example, if there is a fairness cream or something, they tend to they give these unnecessary beauty standards that we buy and makes people necessarily buy a manufactured choice. So how exactly is advertisement helping you in this equation, creating an unnecessary beauty standard in place while actually helping them better in their life? That's my question.
Yeah, okay. So basically, again, I'd like to state this, and I stated this in my debate as well, and I wanted to ask a question regarding this, but answering to your question, getting affected by those beauty standards is our choice. For example, advertising, if you say so that advertising is setting up beauty standards, then again, if we are accepting those beauty standards, then that is our choice. We are accepting that maybe if Fair and Lovely is advertising something, then we need to get there and we need to attain that beauty. We need to attain that fairness. We are making that choice to be accepted in the society, and to be accepted, we need to use that Fair and Lovely and attain that level of fairness. To attain that validation, we need Fair and Lovely. See, they'll advertise. They are giving choices. Whether or not accepting those choices is your decision. It's your liberty.
Thank you, Dishita. We would also like to remind the debaters to keep their questions precise. Now we'll be entertaining questions from the audience. The first question for the opposition is, the target audience for a lot of advertisements are children, like Hershey's and Oreo, and children have impressionable minds. So how can you argue that advertising is not enough to blur the lines between needs and wants?
So basically, what see, even if they're children, the people who are going to buy things from them are their parents. And letting their children, for example, I see children demand everything from a pin to an elephant. They do not think about what their parents' pocket allows. For example, if I was a 5-year-old, I would have seen a Gucci bag, I would have liked it, I would have asked for it. But I cannot afford it. My parents cannot afford it. At least my parents can make that discretion whether or not I will be influenced or not. I might be, but parents are going to make that decision for me. The adults in my house are going to make that decision for me, because I don't have the pocket. I don't earn as much for me to go ahead and buy a Gucci bag or a Hershey syrup or something like that, what my parents' pocket does not allow. So adults, if we are adult enough, the adults in my house are going to make that decision for me. And if their pocket allows, they might be influenced and they would go ahead and buy it if it's absolutely necessary for me. And if not, then they won't.
Thank you, Dishita. The next question for you is by Sohani. Don't you think that when something is printed across all billboards, across all TV channels, across radios, people won't be conditioned into believing it? Don't you think that the decision is made for ourselves through these advertisements?
So basically, yes, they will believe it. I'm sure they will get influenced. But again, the difference is whether or not it is blurring the lines between our needs and wants. For example, if I see it, I might be reminded maybe I need this, but do I want it? No. And if I do need it, it is making my life would be absolutely miserable without that particular thing. I would go ahead and purchase it. For example, if it's a coffee, I would go ahead and purchase it if it's reminding me of my need. But yes, I agree, I will be influenced by it. But is it blurring the line between my need and my want is again different. That exactly is my
Thank
argument.
you, Dishita. The next question for you is, how much is getting affected by beauty standards in our hands? People with body dysmorphia don't choose their misery. How are they to blame? Then ads like Fair and Lovely, which show you that you're worthless in a corporate office if you're dusty. And this question has been posed by Pranav.
Could you repeat the question? I'm so sorry, it wasn't audible.
Am I audible now?
Yeah, clearly.
The question has been asked by Pranav. How much is getting affected by beauty standards in our hands? People with body dysmorphia don't choose their misery. How are they to blame ads like Fair and Lovely, which show you you're worthless in a corporate office if you're dusty?
See, basically what I'm saying is, even if they're showing things like that, accepting the fact that you are not beautiful enough to go ahead and work in a corporate office is your choice. Getting negatively affected is your choice. Accepting the fact that you have to attain those beauty standards, and it's 100% in your hands to accept that fact that you're not beautiful enough to work in a corporate office, you're not beautiful enough to attain that job. So yes, that's what I'm saying.
Thank you, Dishita.
Thank you.
Now we would like to request the audience to participate in the poll that will be popping up soon. Please choose the side and the name of the debater who made you doubt your opinion the most. The poll will be active for only 1.5 minutes, so please participate as soon as you can. The third topic in front of the House today is that the House believes that harm principle is used as a psychologically convincing justification for political overreach. Going for the topic is Aditya Sharma, and going against is Karthik Hede.
Okay, so hi, I'll be representing the four speaking. First of all, should I begin?
No, Aditya, we'll request you to begin.
Okay, sorry, this was silence.
No worries.
Please switch on your video so that we can spotlight you.
Aditya, you have 2 minutes to make your opening argument. Please begin.
Okay, first of all, the harm principle speaks of acting in a manner of total rationality and full complete personal liberty unless you're trying to hurt somebody else. A phrase that would explain it properly would be your freedom to swing your fist ends where my nose begins. This is a perfect illustration. Like you can act out of your own full liberty, but you can't hurt somebody else. This is the principle. The harm principle is not designed to guide the actions of individuals, but to restrict the scope of criminal law and government restrictions of personal liberty. And as a result, it is often used as a means to justify politically overreaching ends. The very purpose of this debate is to lay bare the boundaries between personal freedom and state authority, both factions that have been pitted against one another for a long time. This House does, in fact, believe that the harm principle is a justification for state interference or political overreach, and wrongfully so sometimes, because most government restrictions, contrary to the popular belief, are are implemented in the benefit of the state and not in the benefit of the individual. The harm principle is intended to recognize people as rational agents capable of free choice, and hence suppressing political ideas and opinions in the name of evil or sedition would be morally as well as principally wrong, because then you would not be treating the people as rational agents who are free to make their own decisions. The body of ideas in a nation is an economy where some ideas thrive at certain times and others fall out of favor. This has been the case for centuries. State intervention has time and time and again robbed people of their ability to choose which ideas are good and bad. Because when you limit a person's choice, you limit their ideas and their intentions too. Instead, the state must also allow the body of ideas in the nation to take its own shape and let the principle of harm work as a deterrent rather than a solution in a society of free individual speakers.
Thank you, Aditya. You have elapsed your time. We'll now be moving to the opening argument by the opposition. Karthik, you may begin. You have 2 minutes.
Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Perfect. Thank you. So my name is Karthik, and I will be arguing against this motion. So the harm principle, as advocated by John Stuart Mill, is an absolutist principle, which argues that the state is justified in interfering with the actions of an individual only when such actions cause harm to others. I will argue that this principle needs to be reviewed in today's context and cannot be looked at in isolation. And in doing so, we will find that not only does the state have a right in principle to interfere, but it also has an imposed duty to do so. When our liberties are threatened, we react in an aggressive manner because fundamentally, we all want more freedom, which is why something like the harm principle, which restricts state action, is very attractive to us. However, a civil liberties perspective is individualistic in nature. It is rooted in constitutional guarantees, which are, again, very good when looked at on paper. That is why context is crucial in our understanding of today's debate. We are a society with deeply entrenched prejudices, and allowing freedom to run unchecked breeds anarchy. In fact, using John Locke's social contract theory, we can argue that the state was created to extract us from a world where we lived without restrictions, which in itself was a very brutal world. The creation of the state allowed us to enjoy our liberties without harming them.
Karthik, You're
And
lagging.
over time, this definition of harm has greatly evolved. Our actions serve a private as well as a public function. So in a time when a simple tweet can incite a riot in a democracy as structurally sound as the United States of America, am I audible? I'm sorry, I think my internet connection problem.
Yes, you're lagging.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay,
However, your video is stuck. I think you can proceed. It's all right.
Yeah, is it better now?
Yes, it is.
Okay,
You may continue.
As I said, the creation of the state under John Locke's social contract theory allowed us to enjoy our liberties without harming others. And over time, this definition of harm is something that is greatly evolved given the complexity of today's world. Our actions serve a private function as well as a public function. And in today's time, something as innocuous as a simple tweet can incite a riot in a democracy as structurally sound as the United States of America. Therefore, the definition of harm cannot be written narrowly. Governments have a duty to promote welfare of the public and to prevent harm to society as a complete unit. That is the essence of why the government came into being. Therefore, with regards to the motion, I firmly believe that the harm principle is not being used to justify political overreach. Rather, it is being used to prevent potential harm to society as a complete unit. And the state has a right in principle to interfere with actions that can cause harm. And the manner in which it chooses to exercise this right is contingent and depends on a case-by-case basis. Thank you.
Thank you, Karthik. We'll now be proceeding to the rebuttal by the proposition. Aditya, you have 1 minute. You may proceed. You'll be expected to critique the speech of the opposition.
Okay, so the question I have is that when we talk about the given premises of the debate, the harm principle states that we're treating everyone as rational beings. But however, when we are restricting the actions of somebody else, we are not completely treating them as rational beings, however, but dependent on mass and public psychology. So how does that fit in when we say that harm principle is not used to justify the political overreach?
Sorry, Aditya, you will not be allowed to ask questions in this round. You may continue with your speech.
Okay, so yeah, sorry, sir. So what I'm saying is, again, given the premises of this speech, like the harm principle, the very essence of it again states that, people are rational and they can do whatever they want unless they hurt somebody else. Now, if I were to step in between the fight of two people who were going to completely sort it out, I would get a bad name for myself again. So that is where I think the wrongful justification of harm principle comes in.
Thank you, Aditya. Karthik, you have 1 minute for the rebuttal. You may proceed.
Okay, thank you. Right, so taking and answering your question as well, so we need to understand the context in which John Stuart Mill first propounded the harm principle. It was propounded in England, where a large mass of the people was educated, where they could be considered as rational beings, which is why in today's times, context is greatly relevant because not everyone possesses the same skill set to process information the same way, which is why where you and I might react to an incendiary statement in a rational manner, somebody else might be aggravated by that very same statement and cause violence or incite harm to other people, which is why it is the duty of the state to analyze the best possible reaction to an outcome. Because oftentimes human behavior cannot be adjusted perfectly, which is why it falls on, and if at all the state fails in its duty to prevent harm, and then it is criticized, which is why it's in a very tenacious position, and acting in a safe manner oftentimes serves the public interest better than they realize themselves. Which is why I believe that the harm principle is, rather than using as a justification for political overreach, it's being used rightly to prevent potential harm where the possibility of such actions can cause greater violence.
Thank you, Karthik. We'll now be moving to the cross-examination of the proposition by the opposition. You have 1.5 minutes. You may proceed.
Okay, thank you. So my question is very simple, actually. When faced with individual liberty versus societal well-being, what should a liberal government choose?
Yeah, sorry about that. So basically, when we talk about that society as individual, we make the faults of, treating the government and the ruling body not human. Like when you say state should control it, but we forget in the end that the state is made up of humans, and human emotions, then again, unpredictable. So, given that there's a choice, like I said in my opening speech, people should be given the right to choose what opinions they need to have and what opinions they don't need to have. Opinions that are naturally and socially more dominant will survive in the society, and the ones which are not will continue to die out, as we have seen throughout history. Is the history of economics and social society and it's and politics.
Karthik, you still have time to question the proposition.
Okay, so you said that opinions that are dominant will survive the test of time, right? But in a place or in a country, in a world rather, where the majority often overshadows the minority, what can the state do in order to make sure that the minority's voice is also heard? Because then oftentimes we see that the majority overshadows the minority simply because it's given the same scope of freedom that the minority is afforded. So what do you think in such a situation?
Yeah, I agree with you. And that's what I said, that the government should not suppress opinions. Like, for example, to bring up the majority, to bring up the minority, you're suppressing the majority. That would be, in fact, ethically and morally wrong. However, when you put the minority in the limelight, that would be a more preferred situation. Because when you are suppressing something, whether it is the minority or the majority, there tends to be a backlash or a protest or a riot or, like a difference of opinions.
Thank you, Aditya. We will now be entertaining questions from the audience members. It is a kind request to please keep sending questions throughout the course of the debate. Aditya, Sahani has asked you a question. Consensual harm cannot justify interference. How does implementing the harm principle work in that context?
Okay, so the harm principle, then again, as I stated multiple times in my opening speech, the harm principle basically states that everyone is a rational human being that is acting in their own personal liberty until and unless they have the opportunity to hurt someone else. Like I said, the freedom to swing your fist stops where my nose begins. So we are giving people and assuming that everybody is rational in the society. I believe that answered your question.
Yes, Aditya, thank you. Now we'll be proceeding to the cross-examination of the opposition by the proposition. You have 1.5 minutes. You may begin.
Okay, so like again, in your opening speech, then again, my main question to you remains that that when we talk about two different societies, like not societies, like factions, a personal individual and a government, what would you say is that sometimes the government has its own like opinions, influences, and ideas and intentions because it is made up of the minority or a ruling faction, which are in fact humans. So sometimes, don't you think that political suppression is often motivated emotion with emotions, and not because of benefit and harm?
Right. So if I understood the question correctly, you're saying that sometimes political agenda outweighs the possibility of actual harm. So they create harm where there isn't any.
Yeah, precisely.
All right. So to deal with such a situation, I think, I think there are certain instances when a government has abused its power, as we have seen not only in India, but in other parts of the world as well. But the larger principle remains like, we cannot choose to focus on individual governments or like certain precise moments in time to justify our statements. We need to look at things from a broader perspective. The context is that society has evolved over time, and the factors that incite people today are different than the factors that incited people at that time, which is why we need to give consideration and we need to give governments the benefit of the doubt because they were created for this purpose. They were created for the welfare of the public and to protect them from harm, which is why they need to be afforded that benefit that if they do take any interfering actions, they will act in the interest of the people. And if not, then like you said, we need to trust the people that they will change their choice in the upcoming elections.
Thank you, Karthik.
Yes.
We are now open to questions from the audience members for Karthik. Sahani has asked yet another question. How do you justify abuse in power, especially even in forces like the peacekeeping ones? There is violence.
Could you repeat that, please?
How do you justify abuse in power, especially even when in forces like the peacekeeping ones, there is violence?
Okay, so I think the question in, okay, so basically she means how do we justify?
How do you justify violence which takes place even when we're talking about peacekeeping operations or missions?
Right. So I think in peacekeeping operations, the context in which they operate are very different. You know, most often they're in very tenacious zones, combat zones rather, where normal rules of society do not apply. So the occurrence of violence over there is much more spontaneous, and they need to react in such a manner that kind of merits certain decisions in those situations. When we're talking about a democracy or a general occurrence, justification of violence is not acceptable, which is precisely why the state needs to interfere and prevent actions which cause such violence.
Thank you, Karthik. There's another question for you. This question has been posed by Zohaib Karmali. If a morally unjust action occurs, but there is no apparent form of harm, does an individual not deserve to face any consequences?
Right. So this is where John Locke as well has drawn a distinction between the kinds of harm that we, he's drawn a distinction between harm and offense, basically. Harm is something that sets you back, maybe on a personal level or on a public level, but offense is something that affects you personally, right? So if governments were to interfere when a merely morally statement, is kind of involved, that would be unjustified because people, like we said, interpret matters in different ways. So what may be morally offensive to me might not be morally offensive to you. It's highly subjective in nature. But when a statement affects a large section of society, in those contextual situations, that is when a government needs to interfere. So when we're talking about an immoral statement in isolation, then I don't believe a government needs to interfere because that is a part of the rational discourse that is democracy. So if we don't have those kind of exchanges, then there is no point in having a democracy.
Thank you, Karthik. We are now going to request the audience members to once again participate in the poll. Please choose the side and the name of the debater who made you doubt your opinion the most. You have 1.5 minutes to participate in the poll. We will now proceed to the fourth topic for the day. The House believes that wars have created preconceived notions that are irrevocable. Going for is Ronak Bawa and going against is Adit Seth. Right. Ronak, you have 2 minutes to make your opening argument. You may begin.
Right. I shall begin in 3, 2. Wait, firstly, am I audible clearly?
Yes, you're clearly audible.
All right. Great. Thank you. I shall begin in 3, 2, 1 now. All right. So I stand here arguing for the motion that wars create prejudices in people and societies that are irrevocable. So to understand this argument, firstly, we need to understand what the causes of war are. And generally, the causes of war exist on some fault line or the other. Such fault lines may be religious, political, economic, ethnic, and so on and so forth. There are always some divides or the other that lead to a war taking place. Whether it's a popular war or not is a different matter, but inevitably, these fault lines lead to the various societies involved clashing with each other in a state of war. What happens when war takes place is that those prejudices are then created between those societies. The victor in any conflict views the loser with a sense of superiority, and the loser of that conflict obviously views the other with a sense of jealousy, with a sense of inherent distrust and injustice. These prejudices are always pervasive and deep-rooted within whatever that society is. And I argue that there is a systematic reason why these prejudices are irrevocable, simply because people in any society have an incentive to believe in those prejudices. They have a confirmation bias, and they feel a need for security in loyalty to the in-group, as provide the concept given by Henry Teifel, a Polish social psychologist. And further, there are many social sanctions that are imposed on people from deviating from the norm. So for example, if say in India, people celebrate the victory of Pakistan in a cricket match, then you see very promptly an FIR is lodged against them and they're packed off to jail. This is very evident. There are numerous case studies, whether it is the rise of Islamophobia in America and the lynchings of Muslims in America following 9/11, or whether it is the tensions between Japan and Korea that last even till today after their conflict during the Second World War. The fact remains that wars scar societies, and as a result, following the traumatizing clashes between these societies, these people remain prejudiced to one another.
Thank you, Ronak. Adit, you have 2 minutes to present your opening argument. You may proceed.
Thank you. We know that Germany is now known as the manufacturing. May I start? Okay, yeah. We know now Germany is now known as the manufacturing powerhouse. Japan is a cultural exporter, and Italy is the world's fashion hub. They were also earlier the Axis powers during the Second World War. They were supporters of fascism and Nazism. They enabled the Holocaust. Yet their identity changed because progression of identities and agendas are fundamental to political evolution. Wars change geopolitical systems, forms of governance, and perceptions thereof. Sure, there are short-term losses in perception values, but that does not mean that these changes are irrevocable. You might argue and quibble about certain matches being lost or India-Pakistan issues. There might be faults in authoritarian governance in either of the countries, but that doesn't mean that in the long run, South Asia is not seen as a unique place with shared cultural identity. It does not mean that the perceptions of these geographical locations are always and continually flawed because of these wars and conflicts. If such a proposition was true, we would not see a backlash against the US in the context of Afghanistan. We would not hear of moral debates around American bombing of Nagasaki during the Second World War. If consent was manufactured in a way claimed here, then such transgressions of status quo wouldn't work. Such simplistic theories of war are good for undergrad game theory blogs. But any theorist who realizes analyses like these are not as binary. Let's understand what the proposition is trying to say here. They're trying to tell that if there is one war and that creates a perception of that country, that's never going to change. It's irrevocable. But let's open our history books for a while. Let's look at any country. We know China as the place of Genghis Khan. We know India as, once upon a time, the regime of the ruthless Alexander, who then changed into a more peaceful man. We know these things in short term. Perceptions change in short term. And the proposition seems to claim that they don't change in long term either. It just doesn't make sense. I rest my argument with that fact. It's an empirical case and the facts don't agree with the proposition.
Thank you, Adit. The proposition has 1 minute to critique the speech of the opposition.
May I begin right now? I don't see the timer.
Yes, you may begin.
All right. 3, 2, 1, now. All right. So the opposition talks about empirical cases which disprove the proposition side here. However, so now let's talk about the cases of Germany and Japan, for example. They talk. The opposition talks about how identities have changed and political systems have changed. Be that as it may, several prejudices and perceptions have still lasted even today. Those perceptions may definitely be mitigated today. It would obviously be illogical to believe, to assert that today people believe Germany is still a Nazi country. Obviously, that is not the case. But prejudices still exist while mitigated. So even today, Germany remains a reluctant military power. They remain reluctant in their militarization. So does Japan. Japan is still looked at with distrust by Chinese and South Korean societies after the atrocities it committed in the Second World War. South Asia may be seen as a place of shared culture by a number of people with a utopian vision. The fact remains that the people of South Asia remain deeply divided, and that is reflective in their democratic processes, in their political processes, and their interactions with one another. So their empirical arguments simply do not hold water here.
Thank you, Ronak. Adit, you have 1 minute to critique the opening argument presented by the proposition.
Thank you. Okay, so let's look at what irrevocability means. Irrevocable is a logical proposition that claims that something that is true, it's something true as a fact, a statement of fact. You giving examples of situations where it is true does not mean that it's true in all cases. I might see 4 crows that are black. That does not necessarily imply that every crow is black. That is not how logical statements work. Irrevocability implies that if there is at least one case where this perception does not work, it's not a theory that can be considered generalizable. You're right. Germany might be a hesitant military power. But let's look at what really goes under the perception of it being a hesitant military power. Let's look at NATO contributions by Germany. Let's look at how European Union functions in terms of military. The reason why we don't see Germany as a massive military power is because it doesn't need to be in a way that it was during the World War. It's not necessarily because of how we perceive Germany in the context of Nazism. That's my rebuttal. Thank you.
Thank you, Adit. Now we'll have the cross-examination by the opposition of the proposition. You have 1.5 minutes. You may begin.
Right. So you speak a lot about how these countries perceive themselves in the aftermath of war, right? But here, of course, we are also talking about prejudices of other countries with respect to like countries with respect to each other rather than simply self-introspection, right? So today, whenever we talk about Germany's militarization, why is it that we always say, for example, associate images of Nazi parades alongside Germany's militarization rather than the pure geopolitical aspects of it? Why is it that Germany refused to take up nuclear bombs, citing its legacy, its terrible legacy, historical legacy that it had?
So let's look at it again from the perspective of what's really happening. It's easy to look at these issues as the cause of Holocaust and Nazism. But again, as I said, Germany just doesn't need that kind of military power anymore, or to be perceived as that ruthless of a military power anymore. They use such justifications because they're politically appropriate. India uses the justification of having nuclear powers because there's an enemy across the border. And that doesn't mean that India's perception as a non-violent country changes. These theories of how countries are perceived as because of their history work very well in late night debates on the television. But that's not really how diplomacy works and how general politics works. Military generals are not sitting and thinking about whether, a Twitterati might feel bad about Germany having weapons because they once in their lifetime were Nazi. So that's my argument about whether that works or not.
Thank you, Adit. Now we'll be proceeding to questions from the audience members for Adit. All those who have questions to ask to Adit can again text Rachit. The first question for the opposition is that a poll by the Associated Press NORC Center for Public Affairs Research conducted ahead of the 9/11 anniversary found that 53% of Americans have unfavorable views towards Islam, compared with 42% who have favorable ones. This stands in contrast to Americans' opinions about Christianity and Judaism, for which most respondents express favorable views. So how can you argue that wars haven't created a preconceived notion about certain communities in people's minds?
Let's look at how the US looks at these wars necessarily. For starters, 9/11 was an act of aggression, but I don't consider that a war. I mean, that's a very weird definition of war. But if moving on, let's just assume this as a conflict, right? Even in that context, Americans weren't particularly fond of the Islamic world before 9/11 either. Let's not forget why 9/11 happened. Let's not forget why there is ISIS and Al-Qaeda. It's not like Americans were a particularly inclusive people about Muslims before 9/11. It's ridiculous to assert that the perception of Muslims were created out of a phenomena like 9/11. It was only exacerbated. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Adit. Now we'll be moving on to the cross-examination of the proposition by the opposition. You have 1.5 minutes. Please remember to keep your questions precise.
Thank you. Right. So while you do claim that wars have an irrevocable impact on perception, would you say that, for example, India, for Indo-China's purposes, there was a war between India and China, after which China continues to be what is likely the top two trading partners of India. It tends to have a lot of cultural outflow from India. And despite what media and perceptions talk about Atmanirbharta or letting China go, we still are a massive economic partner of China. Would you say that, these kind of conflicts change anything about what really matters? Do real perceptions in terms of international relations actually change because of wars?
Yeah, so like if I was to draw another parallel to your example, China is Taiwan's biggest partner, and China routinely threatens to invade Taiwan and take over and destroy its entire sovereignty. So the fact is, things like economic policy, trade policy.
I'm sorry to catch you off there, but how is China a partner of Taiwan?
It is a trade partner of Taiwan. It is the largest trade partner. You can check that up later if you want. And the fact remains that these policies that are made by policymakers are often made in a very cynical manner. That's how old corporations work. That is how modern governance works. The fact is, prejudices are rooted in the individuals of a country, rooted in the societies of a country, which may not necessarily be reflected in policy making. And the fact remains that xenophobia is a huge problem in India today. If you just look at the lynching of Northeasterners following the outbreak of COVID in India, you'll see what I mean.
Thank you, Ronak. Now we'll be entertaining questions from the audience members directed towards the proposition. So Suhani has posed a question to Ronak. So essentially, you're saying that there's no scope for anyone to ever break preconceived notions. Doesn't that mean the society will cease to function because at every point of time, there's a feud between two powers?
All right, so I'm not saying that prejudices as a general thing can never be destroyed ever, right? The fact remains that in this specific context, in the aftermath of a war, it is nigh impossible for certain prejudices to be destroyed entirely. Those prejudices may be mitigated. Those prejudices may be redirected to another alien enemy of some conception. The fact remains that wars are a particularly traumatic experience that are experienced by societies as a whole. And people psychologically have that tendency, that need for a sense of security in the aftermath, in that context of fear, that they feel that they must adhere to this herd mentality and adhere to those prejudices. And as I've already explained before, there are huge social sanctions to and a lot of discouragement to deviating from such norms. So if in America you go out and start defending Muslims, as a political party, for example, then tomorrow you might not stand a great chance of getting elected. Or similarly in India, if you go out and say that Pakistanis are great friends of ours, then you might meet a huge amount of backlash from other political players and from society as a whole. So people simply do not get incentives in any society to deviate from such prejudices in the aftermath of something as traumatic as a war.
Thank you, Ronak. Another question for you. It's been posed by Jayaditya Mohan. Wars are caused by fault lines of ethnic and religious basis. The fault lines continue to exist solely because of continued prejudices and stereotypes. So rather than causing prejudices, isn't a war the end product of a long existing, continually enforced prejudice?
Right. Thank you for that question. So as I mentioned in my first speech, I hope it was audible. I mentioned that wars, while they deepen existing prejudices, they also create new prejudices, right? So there may have been certain, so for example, there may not have been a lot of prejudices about Nazi Germany before 1939, but following 1939, Nazi Germany was seen as the scourge of the earth, as evil personified, and then of course those were further reinforced by reports of the Holocaust. Similarly, India and Pakistan may have had a very scarred division. However, there were still a lot of hopes that the two would become constructive allies in the future. The Kashmir wars and all the conflicts that ensued after that effectively shattered all those notions, and today an India-Pakistan reconciliation seems almost impossible, not just for political reasons, but also for cultural reasons, and also because socially, both the people of India and Pakistan are so strongly opposed to each other.
Thank you, Ronak. With that, we come to the end of the fourth debating round. We request the audience once again to participate in the Zoom poll. Please choose the name of the side and the speaker who made you doubt your opinion the most. You have 1.5 minutes to participate in the poll. Thank you, Adit and Ronak.
Thank you.
Thank you.
With this, we conclude our debate. I would like to ask the judges what they thought of the debate. Ms.
Hi,
Nisha.
everyone.
Oh, yes. Hello, Ms. Nisha and Ms. Yvette. You have
I think Dr. Nisha can go first.
Just go ahead. No problem. Yeah.
Okay. So I think firstly, the topics were really, really, really good. And I think it did set up a lot of space for thinking, especially with our stereotypes and our preconceived ideas that we already have, which have been discussed largely in most of the topics of the debate. And I think all the speakers were really, really good. I think all of you have put in a great effort to obviously research, talk about theories that are related to each topic. And I think it's been a very, very close call for all the debaters here. Congratulations. All of you have done extremely well. And sadly, but they have to be winners. But a lot of you did make me think and did change a few of my perceptions that I have about the topic. Thank you, everybody, and all the speakers and all the debaters. Very well done, and all the best.
Thank you for taking out your time, ma'am. We are glad that you could judge our debate.
I'm really sorry. I've been going on and off. I am traveling and I'm in the hills and there's no network here. So I've been using my hotspots because of which I've been going on and off online. So thank you. Sorry if I was off for quite a bit.
No worries, ma'am. Thank you so much. Miss Nisha, you may go ahead.
I'll say it was that all the topics were, I would say, the need of hour. And second thing is all the participants, the way they put across the points, the way they were replying back to the answers, it was like recommendable. And I was finding it out like I'm the old generation 20 years back, and now you are the young generation. Happy to see that people are, they have their own opinions and they're speaking it out literally. And it's you people have a nice platform through this economic and management conclave that you give the opportunity to the students to speak out their heart out, what they believe, what their things. I think so. I believe in opposition always. So I believe if there is a BJP, there would be a Congress. That doesn't matter. So I always believe in politics. It's not about good and bad. It's about bad and worst. So I try to put across the give them marks, but I think so. It was very difficult for me to judge each and everyone. It is not about the way they put across their points. That was very convincing. And I think the best of luck for everyone. And whoever is willing, just don't think whoever is losing that there is something lesser. It is just the other person put across a 1 point more. That's all. But all were awesome.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. I'm sure that everyone...
Just adding on to what Dr. Nisha said, if somebody wins doesn't mean that we actually believe their point of view. It's just that they were convincing enough for us to believe that for some point of time. So that's about it. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. We're glad that you enjoyed the debate. And there were certainly very wonderful insights put forth by our debaters.
And now we begin with the vote of thanks. To all our judges present here, thank you so much for taking out your valuable time and giving us input today. And truly, it was because of you that Speechathon was a successful event. And to all our participants, thank you so much for such a riveting session that ranged from individual rationality to the psychological aspects of war. It was because of your enthusiasm and your participation that we had such a wonderful time today. To our audience, thank you so much for your active participation throughout the event with the questions as well as the polls. You truly made it a complete and a wholesome event. With that, we will soon be announcing the winners. Stay here with bated breath. We'll soon be announcing the winners in the next 3 minutes. All right.